let me give you a simple example. Let's say you have a 2-year-old, and you're the parent of a 2-year-old, and they get angry with you. Now, incidentally, if your 2-year-old doesn't get angry with you, you're not doing your job. Because she can't have that second cookie before dinner. And why should she not be upset? I mean, when you want something, you don't get it, you get frustrated, right? She gets frustrated, so But what if you grew up in a home where your father, excuse me, or mother was a rageaholic, and so that you're terrified of anger? You can't handle it. It brings up too much anxiety for you. So then you give the signal, overtly or covertly, that good little girls don't get angry. What the child gets is that little girls who get angry don't get loved. So then how does she adapt? She adapts by repressing her anger. That's the way she maintains the relationship with you. Because the fundamental dynamic in human life, and the most important factor in the development and existence of human beings, is attachment, connection to another human being.
Think about the first time you ever felt truly powerless. Maybe you were young, too young to even understand why you were told no. The frustration bubbled up inside you, a wave of heat rising in your chest. But in that moment, you weren't just denied what you wanted, you were taught a lesson about who it was acceptable to be. Now fast forward, that tiny spark of frustration, it never really went away. Instead, it simmered, hidden behind polite smiles, silent tears, and a fear of conflict. It became the quiet voice in your head telling you to keep the peace, to bury the anger deep down, because to feel it meant risking love. But have you ever figured out why, as an adult, you react so differently when it comes to expressing your emotions? Why does anger feel so hard to access, or even terrifying? Let's find out together as we dive into the mind of a repressed adult. Dr. Gabor Insights will help us uncover the hidden patterns of emotional suppression and show us what's really driving our responses today.
So there was a case somewhere in the States, not unusual by the way, where, and this went viral just a few weeks ago, a kid somewhere in the States, 8 or 9-year-old or 10-year-old, is in handcuffs, is handcuffed by the school security officer. This same thing is happening up in Canada. We're just reacting to the behavior. And with due deference to BK, when he said, well, trauma is wrong, let's talk about solutions. That's not my approach at all. When I wrote my book on ADHD, which is the first book that I wrote, the Canadian title was Scattered Minds, A New Look at the Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. The American subtitle, the Americans changed the title from Scattered Minds to Scattered, which is kind of an indication of something. The publisher didn't think that the Americans would understand the word minds, I suppose. only to have the same publisher publish a book on ADHD a few years later called Scattered Minds. Just to confuse things. But the subtitle is what's interesting, because my subtitle was A New Look at the Origins and Healing. The American subtitle, How ADD Originates and What You Can Do About It. It's this sort of can-do Yankee self-helpism. You know? And I'm saying, for God's sake, let's just look at it first. Get present to it. Be aware of it. See how it arises. And then, out of that understanding, will come the solutions. As a Hungarian-born, like myself, American psychiatrist Thomas Hora said, when you get the what, then you know the how. And in North America, we're very addicted to the how, but not to the what. We don't really understand things. We don't look deeply enough. We just react to symptoms, behaviors, manifestations that are troublesome, that we don't like, that are pathological, and there's not a look at the source. So here's what I found out, that whether we're looking at mental illness, depression, anxiety, PTSD, ALS, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, behavior problems, we're looking at one thing only, which is the impact of early childhood stress on the individual. And that stress happens in a social context. And so that the ideology of Western medicine, which separates the mind from the body, which doesn't understand that in rheumatoid arthritis, in ALS, there are physical manifestations of lifelong emotional patterns and early stresses that the disease itself is an outcome of, and that therefore if the individual could change their relationship to their emotions and how they function in the world and how they take on stress automatically and what kind of relationships they're in and what kind of work they're doing and how they feel about themselves, that can actually significantly affect the course of the illness in a positive sense. In other words, if they get present to themselves. Many, many examples of that. But these are the things that my profession, despite a whole preponderance of evidence, absolutely ignores. It just doesn't compute. It's like the Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Emotions don't compute. And the medical mind, they don't. Similarly, let's look at just ADHD for a moment. So as I say, I was diagnosed with it in, and I don't have the time to tell you how these early stresses translate into illness. That's a whole other conversation. Except I can tell you that, let me give you a simple example. Let's say you have a 2-year-old, and you're the parent of a 2-year-old, and they get angry with you. Now, incidentally, if your 2-year-old doesn't get angry with you, you're not doing your job. Because she can't have that second cookie before dinner. And why should she not be upset? I mean, when you want something, you don't get it, you get frustrated. Right? She gets frustrated, so But what if you grew up in a home where your father, excuse me, or mother was a rageaholic, and so that you're terrified of anger? You can't handle it. It brings up too much anxiety for you. So then you give the signal, overtly or covertly, that good little girls don't get angry. What the child gets is that little girls who get angry don't get loved. So then how does she adapt? She adapts by repressing her anger. That's the way she maintains the relationship with you. Because the fundamental dynamic in human life and the most important factor in the development and existence of human beings is attachment, connection to another human being. As infants, we're utterly helpless. As infants, we're utterly helpless, and we're more helpless than any other creature, and stay that way longer than any other creature. So without that attachment relationship, we simply don't function, can't live. It's life essential. And throughout life, of course, we evolved as a species of attachment. By attachment meaning, it's a gravitational force that pulls two bodies together, just like you can really say that love makes the world go round, because love is the common word for attachment, connection, where somebody's taking care of somebody else, somebody's holding somebody else, and somebody's being held. Now, gravitation itself is an attachment force. I'm talking about physical gravitation. It pulls two bodies together. And literally, it's gravitation that makes the world go around the sun, isn't it? So when they say love makes the world go round, it's true in the purest physical sense. Well, it's also true in the psychological realm. So when the love, and by love here, I don't mean the emotion that a parent feels towards the child, because I take it for granted that all parents love their kids. And even the hard as it is to fathom, but even the parents who abuse their kids love their kids. They just don't know how else to love them, because they're acting out their own childhood programming. So by love here, in this case, I don't mean the emotion. I mean the capacity to be present with and understand and see the other human being for exactly who they are, and to accept them for who they are, and to invite them unconditionally to be in your presence exactly the way they are. That's what love actually is. And so I can tell you as a parent, I was completely incapable of giving that to my kids, because I was still dealing with my own childhood stuff as an adult. Well, when children don't receive that unconditional, what Carl Rogers called the unconditional positive regard, or the unconditional invitation to be in my presence exactly the way you are, then they have to adapt to that. Why do they have to adapt? Because they need the attachment relationship, without which they can't survive. So without attachment, there's no survival. Therefore, we adapt. And if your child at age 2 gets the message that she's not invited to be in your presence when she's angry, then she won't be angry. Not that the anger won't be there, but she'll repress it. It's not a conscious behavior, it's simply an automatic brain mechanism. Now, when you repress anger, you know what happens in the long term? You're repressing your immune system. Lots of studies have shown that. And the immune system can then fail to function, or it can actually turn against you in the form of autoimmune illness. And that's, in a nutshell, the source of a lot of physical illnesses. Not the only source, but it's a major contributing factor that's utterly ignored in Western medicine, despite reams of evidence. And that's the subject of my book, When the Body Says No. But the first book I wrote, so what I'm saying here is that when there's a loss emotionally, that translates into biology. So it's not that there's biology here and no emotions here. It's that the emotions and the biology are completely inseparable. And what happens on the emotional plane inevitably will have its manifestations on a biological plane. So what you lose emotionally translates into biological events in your body. And that begins with brain development. Now I began to be interested in brain development when I was diagnosed with ADHD. I was 53, I think, 54, 53. And it was a typical self-diagnosis. Somebody I knew told me she's just been diagnosed, and she asked to have coffee with me. And 5 minutes into the conversation, I knew why it was with me that she asked to have coffee. Because everything she said about herself, the distractibility, the poor impulse control, inability to stay on task unless I was highly motivated, the hyper-focusing to the exclusion of other information when I was highly motivated, my addictive patterns, as I said in my book, my Jekyll and Hyde ways of being with my kids. All this, I thought, was explained. It certainly was reflected in the description of the ADD persona. Within a couple of months, 2 of my kids were diagnosed, which seemed to go along with the mainstream medical view that what we've got here is a genetic disorder, which I never bought into for a minute. And why didn't I buy into it? Because although I didn't know anything about the brain or how it developed, I knew something. The tuning out, the absent-mindedness that characterizes ADD is not a disease, inherited or otherwise. What is tuning out? What is it? Anybody?
An adaptive response.
Sorry?
An adaptive response.
It's an adaptive response to?
Stress.
To stress. So that if I were to stress you right now, but I mean though that is to be verbally abusive, emotionally insulting, domineering, you would go into a stress state. And how could you deal with it? Well, you could just walk out the door. Or you could stand up and say, you can't talk to me like that. I will not accept it. And if you couldn't walk out, nor did you have the strength to confront me, to fight back, if flight or fight wasn't available to you, there's still a third thing you could do. There are, what, 100, 200 people here in the room with you. You could ask for help. But what if you couldn't do any of those things? Then how would you handle the stress? Well, you wouldn't. Your brain would handle it by a number of defense mechanisms, the salient of which would be dissociation. You dissociate. All of a sudden, you're not here. Now you're not suffering as much. So it's simply a coping response is all it is. So that's what I knew. And here's what they say. Now this article brings together a lot of the research on child development and stress. And here's the salient paragraph. They say, growing scientific evidence, excuse me, demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost in long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the way we adapt to early stress helps us endure that difficult period in the life of the helpless child, but those same adaptations become source of pathology, threaten your health, threaten the length, your longevity even. So what's adaptive in one situation, what's meant to be a temporary state, becomes a long-term trait. And when it goes from state to a trait, now it's a source of dysfunction and pathology. So that's what I intuited about the tuning out. But what I didn't know, and this is astonishing, it's not so much that I didn't know it. That wasn't so astonishing, because it wasn't yet, when I went to medical school in the 1970s, this wasn't knowledge yet that was acknowledged and published and freely available. But what I'm about to tell you now, and some of you are probably aware of it already, is how the brain actually develops. And how the brain develops is in interaction with the environment. So that the brain is not genetically programmed. The potentials are genetically set, and the trajectory of development in terms of what circuits will develop when, that's set genetically, but how they will develop, how successfully they will unfold and connect, and what systems in the brain will become to dominate, that's not genetically programmed. That depends on the interaction of that individual with the environment. So that the physiology of the brain, so when you do brain scans of mentally ill people, with ADHD people, addicted people, you can, in the adult phase, you can see typical, or at least frequently occurring brain patterns. And you say, aha, the problem is in the brain, because here it is, it's an abnormal brain scan. And so the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction as a primary brain disease. Primary brain disease, it arises in the brain. And they say it's 50% at least genetically determined. Utter nonsense. It's not even 5% genetically determined when you actually look at the scientific evidence. Because what they don't get is that what they're looking at in terms of biology in these adult brain scans reflects the child's early experience. That the brain is actually shaped by early experience. So if you take a kid with ADHD and you give him stimulant medications like Ritalin or Dexedrine or Adderall, such as I took for a few years, what we're trying to do is to elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Dopamine is essential for incentive and motivation. Dopamine, incidentally, is what all the stimulants give you. So guess what? Cocaine addicts, nicotine addicts, caffeine addicts, crystal meth addicts, many of them are looking for that hit of dopamine to make them feel more alive and present. It's a self-medication. Well, that's what we give to ADHD kids. Now, you take infant monkeys, and you measure their dopamine levels, and then you separate them from their mothers, you know what you find? Within a week, their dopamine levels fall way down. You isolate monkeys or rats, and the number of dopamine receptors diminish. You put people in isolation, their dopamine function diminishes. We make people crazy by putting them in isolation. We're actually messing with their brains, because the brain is responsive physiologically to the psychosocial environment throughout the lifetime. The most so as children, but it's a fact throughout life. And so that to look on human beings as separate entities, and then as illnesses, as the problems in a separate organ in the human body, is scientifically absolute nonsense. And this is how medicine is practiced. And so we know, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. A study here in California. In polluted areas, of course, there's more asthma, but it's the children whose parents are most stressed who are most likely to get the asthma. In other words, the parents' emotions themselves program the lung physiology of the child, if you can get that. So that human beings are biopsycho. I won't go into the mechanisms of it, except to tell you that if you've been treated for asthma, you might know this, but the medications we give for asthma, you know what they are? Steroids and a copy of adrenaline. We treat asthma with stress hormones. To open a kid's lungs or an adult lungs, we give them adrenaline to open their airways and steroids to suppress the inflammation. Adrenaline and steroids are manufactured by our adrenal glands on top of our kidneys in response to stress. And what's happened to these kids is that they've been overstressed by the stress of their parents. Their stress mechanism has been exhausted. Now we have to give them extra stress hormones to keep their airways open. And by the way, steroids, cortisol, is the commonest medication that we use in rheumatoid arthritis, colitis, multiple sclerosis, dermatitis, psoriasis, eczema, conditions of the lung, scleroderma, multiple sclerosis. We give people infusions or ingested cortisol, the stress hormone. Do you think we might pause for a moment and say, my gosh, is it possible that some things happen to the stress mechanism of these people? And is that possible, therefore, that what we're dealing with are the lifelong impacts of stress, the biology of loss, and that originates back to childhood? That's not a question that the medical profession asks itself. We just go ahead and, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, because we're not looking. So, I'll read you short 2 sentences again from the same article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And they talk about brain development. And I'm not going to go into the details of how this happens, but I'm just summing it up for you. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Second sentence. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain, and is critically influenced by what? The mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the most significant factor shaping the physiological development of the brain is the emotional relationship with the parenting environment. And the necessary condition for optimal brain development, which is so rarely available in North America, are Parents who are emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, non-depressed, and mutually responsive or attuned to the child. Now, anything that interferes with the capacity of the parent to offer those qualities to the child will have its impact on brain development. So, if you look at my ADHD, it's really easy to understand. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, Jewish parents. This is Second World War, and when I'm 2 months old, the Nazis occupy Hungary. The genocide had already exterminated most Jews in Eastern Europe. Now it was Hungary's turn. The day after, this is a story I tell commonly, but the day after the Wehrmacht, the German army, marches into Budapest, my mother phones the pediatrician, and I'm 2 months old. And she says, "Would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time." And the pediatrician says, "Of course I'll come, but I'll tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." Now, what are you supposed to be going on? I mean, as infants, what do we know about Nazis, Hitler, genocide, Second World War? Nothing. What are we responding to? The stress of our mothers. And the stress of our mothers program our brains. At the University of Washington in Seattle, they did an EEG study of 6-month-old infants whose mother had postpartum depression. And comparing them to the, electroencephalograms of children's, of 6-month-old infants whose mothers were not depressed. And you could tell from the EEG of the infant whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. The mother's emotional states program the electrical circuitry of the child's brain. It's really that simple. Or the chemistry of it, like with the dopamine that I mentioned. So here's a quote from the California-based spiritual teacher and profound psychologist, A.H. Almas. He says, "The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged." Now, what do you do as a 2-month-old, and that was my first year of my life, when your mother is depressed, terrorized, in grief over the death of her parents in Auschwitz, the absence of her husband in a forced labor camp? As a 2-month-old, as a 6-month-old, what do you do with that pain and stress? You tune it out. But when do you tune it out? When your brain is developing. When every second, there are periods in the first year of life, when every second, in this space of time, millions of brain connections are being made. Guess what? That adaptation of tuning out goes from a temporary state to a trait. And so 52 years later, I'm finally diagnosed with ADHD. Why my kids? My kids grew up in Vancouver, no war. My kids weren't abused. There was no substance addiction. I wasn't an alcoholic or anything like that. I was a workaholic, physician. Why was I a workaholic physician? Because the message I got from the world very early on is I wasn't wanted. Not because my mother didn't want me, but for the child to feel wanted, the mother has to be happy. The mother has to be emotionally present. And children, when they don't get that, it's all about themselves. Children are truly narcissistic in that sense. It's not a pejorative, just a statement of reality. They think it's all about themselves. They think it's all about themselves. When you see a narcissistic personality like Donald Trump, what you're seeing is a highly traumatized person who still thinks it's all about him because he didn't get those needs met as a child. So he's still trying to get it. Pay attention to me. So the personality that we develop actually is an adaptation.
As a child, I didn't just need food, shelter, or warmth. I needed to feel connected, to feel seen and understood. This is what Dr. Gabor work has helped me understand on a deeper level. We don't often think about attachment as more than physical proximity, but it's that emotional bond that really shapes who we become. When that connection is missing or inconsistent, the effects are profound. And here's where it gets personal, that feeling of not being enough or tuning out when things get too overwhelming. It's not just a quirky personality trait. It's a survival mechanism I learned early on. Dr. Gabor explains how, when our caregivers, often stressed, busy, or unavailable, can't be fully present, our young brains adapt. For me, I learned to suppress certain feelings, to keep my emotions in check, believing that maybe if I wasn't too much, I'd stay connected, stay loved. It's fascinating and also a bit heartbreaking to realize how those early patterns still influence how I respond to stress or conflict as an adult. What struck me most about Gabor Insights was how he reframes mental health issues like ADHD, not as inherent flaws, but as adaptations. When I think back on my own childhood, I can see how I learned to tune out in certain situations, not because I wasn't capable of focusing, but because it was too painful to stay present. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding that our minds were shaped by circumstances we couldn't control. What's empowering is the shift in focus that Gabor encourages, looking at these behaviors not as lifelong labels, but as symptoms of unmet needs, particularly around attachment. I realized that healing starts with recognizing that those behaviors were my brain's way of protecting me. It's why mindfulness and other practices that reconnect us with ourselves are so powerful. They offer a way to rebuild that attachment to our own emotions that may have been missing in childhood. And then there's the societal piece. The pressure to have it all with limited support for caregivers is something that has affected generations. Short parental leave, a lack of focus on attachment in education, and the hustle culture all compound the problem. It's made me rethink not just my own experiences, but how we, as a society, prioritize emotional well-being. Dr. Gabor work has given me a new lens, a way to see how early stress shaped my mind and how those patterns are still there today. But more importantly, it's shown me that with awareness, there's the opportunity for change. It's not about being stuck with the past, but understanding it so we can build healthier connections in the present for ourselves and for future generations.
I'll go into that in a moment. Go back to my own kids. So, and then when I was a year old, my mother actually gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life, because she didn't know if she'd be alive the next day. And so I didn't see her for a month. Deep sense of abandonment, not being wanted. Now, I don't recall that. I can't recall being handed to a stranger in the streets of Budapest, because there's nothing to recall with. The brain's organ in the brain, the hippocampus, that encodes recall memory is not developed then yet. It doesn't develop till later. But the emotional implicit memory of abandonment is deep in me, so that when 5 weeks ago I arrived home from Vancouver, from Philadelphia, from a speaking engagement, I'm feeling really good about myself. I think I'm really centered and grounded, haha. And my wife does not pick me up at the airport, or she texts me saying I'll be 15 minutes late. I go into a rage. What's that rage about? The woman whom I need is not here for me. That's an implicit memory. And we're governed by these implicit memories until we become aware, until we become conscious, until I can notice that anger rising up in me. Anger rising. What's that about? Like Thich Nhat Hanh talks about calming. First of all, you recognize that there's an emotion arising inside you, and then he says, you accept it. Right now, there's anger. And then you hold the anger mindfully, like you'd hold a baby. And then you look, what is it actually all about? And then the insight comes, this is old stuff. Okay, well then, nothing to be upset about, right? So the solution is mindfulness, but I'm laying out the problem for you, which is the implicit memories. Now with my children, and so since I wasn't wanted, I have to compensate. Now how do you compensate for not being wanted? By making yourself needed. They may not want me, but they're going to need me. So this is going to be on all the time. And I'm available for all my patients all the time, 24/7. And I'll never say no to taking on more patients, because that's another sign that I'm being wanted, right? Or needed. Where does that leave my kids? With the sense that they're not wanted, because daddy's not around. And mommy is so stressed, because daddy's not around. So they tune out. No, they're diagnosed with ADD. Genetic disease? Nonsense. Multi-generational trauma and stress being passed on as it affects brain development. And if you want to understand why we're seeing a preponderance of childhood developmental disorders, like all these diagnoses, autism, 40-fold increase, childhood bipolar illness, so-called, depression, anxiety, ADHD, conduct disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, which, by the way, if I have time to tell you, doesn't even exist. It's a figment of the imagination, oppositional defiant disorder. But all these diagnoses, behavior problems, the school problem, the learning difficulties, you know what we're looking at? We're looking at the biology of loss as it's affecting the brains of our children. And then how we respond to it is with medications and behavior control. Instead of saying, what's going on here? Or what's going on here is that our children are acting out their lost attachment relationships. And so what else do? If they lose their attachment, if the adults are not available to them, the adults are not present. You know, when a duckling hatches from the egg, he immediately imprints on the mother duck. And imprinting is an attachment drive. So imprinting means that I'm going to follow you. You're going to be my mentor, my nurturer, my protector, my model. And it's by being with you that I'll survive, and it's by being with you that I'll learn how to be a duck. But we well know that the attachment drive is absolutely biological. It's not negotiable. And if the creatures and entities that nature had intended would be there for your attachment needs are not there, you're still going to attach. But to whoever's around. So that little duckling will then attach to a moving mechanical toy or a horse, will imprint on them and follow them around, none of which are capable of bringing that duckling up to adulthood. Our children, guess what? When the adults are absent, and in your country particularly with the barbaric attitude towards maternal leave, where is it 6 weeks of unpaid leave or something? Well, that child needs to be with the mother for at least 9 months, 3 years actually. Or the father, some nurturing, mothering parent. Any wonder? Then we put them in daycares, where the daycare workers are not trained to understand attachment, because attachment is just not taught. It's not taught in medical school, it's not taught in educational faculties, it's not taught in faculties of training of child workers. It's all about mechanics, behaviors, so on and so forth. Well, the most important thing is attachment. So, what do children do? Well, they're programmed to attach, like the duckling. But the nurturing adults are not around. And the adults who are around are not nurturing. They'll attach to other kids. So that's another book I wrote called Hold On to Your Kids. It's about how children become necessarily attached to other children, and now they become each other's models. Because once you attach, you start to orient. So orientation, or getting a sense of direction, how to be, how to talk, how to walk, you get that from the people that you attach to. In a culture incidentally, like a tribal culture. Darcia Narvaez at Notre Dame has done studies on the optimal parenting environment, and she thought it to be the hunter-gatherer tribe because multiplicity of adult attachments, not just mom or dad, uncles, aunts, elders, grandparents, cousins, the whole tribe is a parent to the child. And children are never put down. There's none of this nonsense of putting a kid down at night and letting him cry it out so he goes back to sleep. What barbaric custom that is. Taught by doctors, sleep specialists. For God's sakes, what we're teaching parents is to ignore their kids' need for attachment. What message is the kid getting? That the world doesn't give a damn. Sure, he'll go back to sleep. You know why he goes back to sleep? To get away from the pain. And you've imprinted in his brain that the world doesn't care. And the Buddha said that with our minds we create the world. What he didn't say was that that's modern psychology. That before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. So when we have a mind in which we're ignored, in which we're not present with, we won't be present to ourselves. We'll ignore our own needs, or we'll try and get through adaptations by suppressing our anger or being super nice, or if we didn't get the attention needed, then we want to attract attention, so we become super consumed with how we look, hence the $15 or $30 billion cosmetic surgery industry in your country. These are just adaptations to loss. And the personality that we develop is not who we are. It's largely an adaptation. Donald Trump is not his personality, but he thinks he is. He's totally identified with it. So, now the solution. So there's a clip I was going to play you. So this is the reality of our society. This is what's going on. This is what's happening. We have to get present to the fact that this is how it is. We really not wish it to be that way, but this is how it is. Any frustration or resentment that we have around it is our own resistance to reality. So we got to be at peace with the fact that this is how it is. And then, what do? Well, there's a clip I was going to play you by the spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle that I've just been watching. But we couldn't make it work mechanically, but I'll try and paraphrase it for you. He said the schools are teaching mathematics, they're teaching science. These are not the most important things.
So whatever arises in the now is completely accepted.
I will read an Eckhart Tolle speech from one of his speaking engagements, and it goes like this. And in through that a deeper dimension suddenly reveals itself to you, and that I sometimes call the spaciousness around things, the spaciousness around whatever the content is. And then you can take the whole story in your head of me and my past and my life situation, and see also that it's surrounded by spaciousness. Another word for that spaciousness is the now. What that means is you become aware of the now in which everything happens. Undoubtedly, it cannot happen anywhere else. Nothing can happen outside that field of now. Mostly people are not aware of the field. They're only aware of what happens in the field. Not only are they aware of what happens in the field, they are identified with what happens in the field of now. And they react to what happens in the field of now in their search for a self and their search for a self. Whatever arises in the field of now, they cling to or they run away from. There's an identification with content that happens, and there's complete ignorance of the vastness in which it happens. So you get trapped in form, and by reacting to every form that arises in the now, your own form identity gets stronger. The illusion that you are this psychological form with its story, and this physical form gets stronger with every reaction to another form that arises. This is the secret of life. The mystery when you see that, how that operates. And then you can see why the self needs the reactivity for its continued life. It perpetuates itself through reactivity. Because every time you react to something, There's a strengthening of your form identity, the psychological sense of me. You can see how the me loves discussions, how the me loves to be right. And so you react to this person's opinion. You can even spiritually, maybe it happened to you this weekend. Somebody gave an opinion, and there was the reaction saying, no, you're wrong. I know better. Maybe you do. But there's a self-seeking there, and there's a strong energy behind it, the reactivity. So most people go through life in that mode of reactivity, and whatever arises in the now, they react to. And most of the time it's a no to a form arises, and there's a subtle turning away from it. So to see that is the beginning of freedom.
The most important thing that a human being can learn is how to be a human being. It's how to be. How to be with what there is. So how to be when emotions arise, how to be with those emotions. When thoughts arise, how to be with those thoughts and recognize that you're not your thoughts and you're not your emotions. Now, this is not something that you teach formally. And you don't, as he points out, you don't talk to kids about mindful awareness. Doesn't mean a thing to them. But you are mindful awareness. And you work on yourself. You create that space in your life so that when you're engaging with another human being, you can actually be with them exactly how they are. And not have an agenda, not have resentment, not have resistance, not have anxiety, not be reactive. And when children are acting out, you really understand what acting out is about. See, acting out, when you talk about acting out, we often think of a kid who is obstreperous, defiant, aggressive, uncooperative. So he's acting out. He can't act out in my presence. What does the phrase acting out mean? We act something out when we don't have the words to say it in language. In a game of charades, you're not allowed to speak. What do you have to do? You have to act it out. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language, and you have to convey that you wanted food, there's no words you could use. You'd have to go, you'd have to act it out. Yes, kids are acting out all the time. Adults are acting out all the time. Addicts are acting out their trauma. In the downtown east side, they're soothing, they're numbing their pain. All addictions are about numbing pain. Where I worked in 12 years in the downtown east side, there was not a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child, not one. Hundreds of women I interviewed. All the men had been traumatized. If you do the research literature on addiction and trauma, huge correlation. I don't have to go into all the details, I don't have time. And without meaning to be shilling for my books, I want you to read them. I want you to read them because they contain all the truth that I've been able to distill from my own experience and from my reading of the research literature. So my book on addiction is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. And so it's an adaptation, it's another adaptation. The addiction is just another adaptation. Let me give you, I'm going to stop speaking a moment to take questions. Let me give you a quick definition of addiction. Any behavior that you find some temporary pleasure, enjoyment, or relief in, and which you crave, but which in the long term has negative consequences. Any behavior. So notice I said nothing about drugs. There's this whole idea that addicts are drug. No, most addicts are not into drugs at all. Most addicts are into sex, or food, or shopping, or work, or entertainment, or internet, or sports, or whatever it is. And of course, there's nothing intrinsically bad about eating, or about enjoying a sports game, But I'm talking about the addictive quality of it, or the addictive relationship to it. So addiction is not in the activity, it's in your relationship to the activity. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. By that definition of addiction, how many of you, and of course it can include substances, right? By that definition of addiction, how many of you would acknowledge that you've had some or another addictive behavior in your life, sometime or another? Well, hardly anybody. Okay, thank you. Great. Let me ask you this. Some of you, if you just raise your hand and tell me, not what was bad about it, because we already know. What was good about it? What did you like about it? What did it give you in the short term? Anybody? Sorry? Yes?
Dopamine.
No, that's a theoretical answer. What did it give you that you liked?
Energy.
It gave you energy, okay. Thank you. What else?
Relief.
Relief?
Relief.
From?
Pain. Stress.
From pain, stress. Okay, what else?
Power.
Power. Okay, we could go on, but look at this. Energy, power, relief from pain. Anything wrong with any of that? These are normal human aspirations, to be free of pain, to have power. I mean, power in one's own life, not necessarily over others. and to be energized. The addiction wasn't your problem. Your problem was, why did you have lack of power in your life? Why did you lack energy? Why did you have so much stress or pain that you needed to numb yourself out? And why couldn't you? Why didn't you? This is not an accusation, it's just an inquiry. What happened in your life that you didn't learn how to handle stress in a more present kind of way? That you had to escape from it, thereby creating more stress. In other words, the addiction is not the fundamental problem. It's actually a response, and it's another adaptation. Everything is an adaptation, that's what I'm saying. That's the biology of loss. And of course, if you were stressed, or as many addicts were, directly traumatized as children, also your brain circuits of dopamine and endorphins and stress hormones, they're not developing properly, so that the medications or the drugs or the behaviors actually regulate your brain temporarily. It's all an adaptation. Which means that if we want to prevent these problems in kids, we got to recognize these kids, what's going on in their lives. Those of us that are healers or educators, in any way interacting with young kids, it's our own mindfulness and our capacity to be present with their problems without panic. Or if we have panic around it, we have to recognize it's our problems. It's not caused by the child. We have to open that space for them to exist in our presence unconditionally. And then, by whatever means is appropriate to the age of the child, we guide them towards learning how to be. Not how to do, but how to be. How to be with themselves in a way that's comfortable. Thank you.
Now I'll take questions for Gabor from the audience.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say that this is a paradigm shift for me about ADHD. So it's taking time to process what you said. But my son, who has that diagnosis, I remember going on a walk with him to Tennessee Valley, and he saw a mouse being stung by a bumblebee, and he saw so many things that no one else could see. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes wondered that label of ADHD in another environment was that maybe he was the scout of the tribe. And so that I had more the paradigm that it was genetic, and that if he had lived in another time or another place, it might have been a good thing.
That's a nice story, and it's comforting, but it's not helpful, because he's not living in another time. Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. First of all, if you consult your own sense of your own history when you were pregnant with that child, and then he was small, I'm not going to ask you, but I'm just going to invite you to consider, were there stresses that are active on you at the time that would have impacted him, that he would then find a tuning or an adaptation from? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I tell you what is genetic here. not the ADD. The ADD is not genetic. The tuning out, what's genetic about tuning out? What's genetic about being late for everything? What's genetic about the fact that several times a year I lose my electric toothbrush in some hotel room? There's no gene for losing your electric toothbrush in a hotel room, okay? What's genetic is sensitivity. Now, your child is highly sensitive. And since he notices things that other people won't. So these are the people who are the artists, they're the creators, they're the wise people.
Wow, that completely reframes how we see addiction, doesn't it? Dr. Gabor challenged us to look beyond the behavior and understand the underlying need it fulfills. We learned that addiction isn't about the substance or activity itself, but the desperate attempt to manage stress, pain, or lack of power. The real question becomes, why do we need to escape? It's often rooted in early experiences that shaped our ability to cope. This is especially true for children experiencing trauma or chronic stress. Their developing brains adapt by seeking relief through behaviors that might later become problematic. So, the shift is from blame to understanding. For those who work with children, it's crucial to develop our own mindfulness to create a safe space for them to explore their emotions. We can guide them towards healthy coping mechanisms, how to be rather than just how to do. This perspective on ADHD is particularly interesting. Perhaps those seemingly disruptive behaviors are a child's way of navigating the world with heightened sensitivity. Imagine the scout of the tribe, noticing details others miss. The key takeaway? Let's move beyond labels and explore the root causes. By creating supportive environments, we can help both children and adults develop healthy coping mechanisms and thrive. Gabor once said, "The addiction is not the problem, it's actually a response." It's a desperate attempt to cope with underlying pain, stress, or a lack of power. By understanding this, we can shift our perspective from blame to compassion and support. Let's commit to creating a world where everyone feels safe, seen, and heard. Let's prioritize mental health, break down stigmas, and empower each other to heal. Remember, you're not alone. There's help available. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to Inside Serene for more inspiring content and mental fitness tips. Together, we can create a more compassionate and understanding world.